Hello everyone, and welcome to a video I've been wanting to do for some time. And this one is going to be about how to learn how to pump but using a wing for assistance. I personally think that using a wing is a great way of doing it. It has a lot of advantages which I'll go into detail in the following sections. There has been a great recent video by Mike Burt and Mark Shin on using the foil drive. And you should definitely check that out. I'll maybe share a link up here or put it in the description. But not everyone has a foil drive or someone with a boat that can give them a tow. And I think using a wing is a really good way to enter into learning how to pump. And learning how to pump has a lot of advantages for your winging, for subfoiling, if you want to end up dock starting, and even if you go to the foil drive, it can help with that too. But I think the main advantages of actually using a wing is, first of all, the wing gives you a lot of extra stability. When it's in your hand, even when it's flagged out, you've got something to hold on to, and it means your arms aren't flapping all over the place. You can use the wing kind of partially powered, and that can help you to kind of vary the amount of assistance to kind of help you pump for longer. It also really naturally helps you transition into wave riding. You're doing all of the actual, all of the mechanics of getting into a wave and pumping with the wing. So I think it works really, really nicely for that. It also means that you can kind of go in at whatever speed you want. You can be cranking along or going at a nice leisurely pace. And you can also get that foil into the perfect position, really, really nice and high out of the water, which something like a foil drive you can't do so well, because obviously the second your mast gets a certain distance out of the water, the foil drive is not actually engaged anymore. So there's a great deal of advantages for using the wing, and I will share these with you in the coming sections. So first things first, it's worth talking about kit and conditions. You can just use whatever you've got, and by all means do, but some of the things that I will be talking about next are some of the things which will perhaps make your life a little bit easier. It might mean the difference perhaps between a 10-second pump or a 15-second pump. So let's start with a board, for example. So I think it's good to go with as small a board as you can actually get away with. But when I say get away with, this needs to not make your life horribly difficult. You can get really tiny sinker boards, which when up and foiling are lovely, they're brilliant to pump. But every time you fall in, you're going to pay a big penalty before you get started again. So try to use a board that's reasonable in its dimensions in terms of getting up and going again, but ideally as small as it can be, for actual pumping and making pumping easier. As I say, nothing too huge. Ideally a fairly light, high performance board would be really good. Personally, I really like the Nomad here. I think that's a great board for it. Nice and lightweight, not too long. Gets up and going really, really easily. Really good solid connection to the foil. But yeah, ideally not on these gigantic, great big learner boards. And, as I say, the other end of things where you've got these tiny short boards that are really, really difficult to get going. And every time you fall in, you don't want to, you want something that you can try and, rinse and repeat over and over again without having that fear of failure and, being in the drink for 5-10 minutes before you get started. So yeah, that's it for boards. In terms of foils, ideally go for something that's fairly high aspect, medium to high aspect ratio. And again, nothing too big ideally. You do see the pump foilers going out on these, 2000 foils. But really I think, you should be in that range, sort of somewhere around 1200, 1300. Plus or minus based if you're a heavier rider or a lighter rider. I personally really like the 1100 AK Plasma. It's a lovely high aspect ratio 11 I think it is. And that's a really, really nice foil to ride and to pump. You do want a foil that's pretty user-friendly, so nothing crazy technical to use, no really tiny stabs that give you loads and loads of performance, but you really suffer in terms of the actual stability. I'm sure you know your kit best, but yeah, try to find something that's pretty easy to use, nothing too crazy high performance. A good all-round setup which will make your life easy. And finally, in terms of wings, I think you can largely use whatever you've got. I would say if you've got a nice lightweight wing, that will help. Something that flags really nicely. Those are really good, especially when you're riding downwind. But yeah, something that stays nice and neutral in the air. Perhaps a wave specific wing if you've got something like that, and a lightweight one. But largely, yeah, just use whatever you've got. In terms of conditions, I'd say flat water is great if you can get it. Of course you can have swell and that can help you, but sometimes you won't really know if you're actually progressing or if you just happen to hit a bit of swell, at the right time. So in order to kind of remove one of the variables, if you can, try and get some flat water. Means you'll be able to ride that foil up nice and high. Yeah, I think it's just great for consistency if you can get some flat water conditions. In terms of wind strength, ideally kind of, light wind or strong wind or anywhere in between is pretty good. Obviously light winds you'll generally get some flatter water, which will mean you can ride that foil higher without worries of breaching. And when you get to the stronger ends of the wind, you'll get an extra bit of a push from your behind, which can actually be quite significant and can help you pump for that much longer. So yeah, in terms of wind, anything as long as it's not too crazy overpowered. Okay, let's talk about pumping technique. Now there's actually two techniques you need to know. One is the speed generation technique and the other is the height generation technique. You won't be using one or the other necessarily. You'll probably be using a blend of the two, and based on your current situation, you need to either be generating a bit more speed or a bit more height. But it's good to know them both individually, so you can understand them. Now, if you've watched a lot of pumping videos, you'll probably see, the aficionados of pumping will say that there's three techniques, and they're probably right, and all power to them. But for simplicity's sake, let's just say there's two, and I think you can get an awful long way with just knowing the two and knowing how to blend them together based upon your situation. So, with that said, let's move on to the speed generation technique. Now, when I first started learning to pump seriously about a year ago, one of the first things I found was actually I was stood too far forward on my board. Now I ride very even front and back foot pressure, and perhaps if you ride very heavy front foot pressure, you might be in the right position already. But regardless of that, what I found is when you're winging, you find a certain balance point. But when you take that wing power away, you will find that you're not quite in the right position to pump effectively. And what you should actually do, and what I found out, was I should move my back foot back. Now, the one thing that you should try and do to actually find the right position for you is to push down hard on the board. Now, you should get to the point where the board just doesn't want to move vertically. I found that when I was in my regular wing, my winging position, the board would pitch the nose down when I did that. And you do get a little bit of speed from that, but it's not as efficient as it can be. I found that by moving my back foot back, you get to that point where the board becomes really difficult to push down. Not completely movable, but you'll certainly be able to tell the difference. It's a very different feeling that you get when you're actually in that right spot. Now, the way that this generates speed is a bit like, when you get a pip from an orange and you squeeze it between your two fingers and it flies out forward. You're putting your foil in the same position as that, you're pushing it down and it doesn't want to go down, and you give it the only option of going forward. So it will accelerate forward and you will gain speed, much more than this pitching up and down, which generates a little bit of speed. So that is basically the speed generation technique, and it's all about finding that sweet spot where when you push down, the board is hard, it's difficult to move, and it will accelerate forward. And you should practice riding along and pumping repeatedly. You should hopefully feel that it zips forward a little bit every pump. It's a very, very different feeling to the board, porpoising up and down. So that is the primary speed generation technique. Next up, let's talk about the height generation technique. You'll see a lot of people talking about this in pumping, because actually keeping height is really, really important. The higher your foil is out of the water, the more efficient it is. It's one of your primary concerns. A lot of people talk about this as, kind of jumping off the board, and weighting yourself off the board. So what you're basically trying to do is to effectively jump off the board, but effectively still stay in contact with it. Now, people talk about, raising your heel up off the board. And that is true. That's definitely what you want to be doing. You want to be jumping forward, but keeping your feet in contact with the board. You could, I don't think anyone's really explained this very well. If you literally jumped off the board, literally managed to jump off the board fully, your board would, you'd lose control of it. And when you landed on it, it might fall down one way or the other. So what you're actually wanting to do is you want to jump off the board, but still keep part of your foot in contact. So you're pushing down, presumably at the right spot, once you've learnt the speed technique, and you're jumping forward, keeping yourself in contact with the board, mainly controlling the pitch of the board with your front foot, but keeping your back foot in contact with the board, certainly with the board of your foot. And the other thing you're wanting to do is kind of scoop the board. So rather than the speed technique where you're just kind of pushing up and down and it's just squirting forward, in this case you're wanting to push down and then angle the board upwards and then unweight yourself and then bring your weight down onto your front leg to pitch the nose of the board down, to then repeat the cycle again where you're pushing down, exploding upwards, forward and down, exploding upwards, pitching the board upwards, and then forward and down. It's pretty difficult to kind of explain this in my living room, and I'll show you lots of footage of this, and it is really a feel thing. Through doing it over and over and over again, you'll learn how to do it. But those are the two main techniques. The speed technique, it's largely pushing down hard and that board will accelerate forward, and the gaining height technique, which is kind of very similar in the way that it works in the case of the pushing down, but it is more of totally unweighting yourself, getting your weight forward and then down. With the speed generation technique, the board is only pitching up and down a little bit, and with the height generation technique, the pitch of the board is significantly more exaggerated, as is your jumping forward and your unweighting. So, with all of that said, let's move on to showing you some footage. So now let's talk about pumping for speed generation on the water. So hopefully, before you've got to this point, you've actually worked out where that place on your board is where it's difficult to push down, and now you're actually wanting to try to practice this technique. So you've shuffled your weight, as I say, generally backwards a bit, and then you'll be pushing down explosively to get that board to kind of squirt forward. So let's look at this now. So I'm going to get this playing, going to bear off downwind a little bit, and now you'll see me explosively push down on the board. and you might see it squirt forward a little bit, although it is a little bit hard in this video, in this particular direction. So just repeating this again, you're bearing off downwind and then explosively pushing down on the board, and hopefully you'll feel it accelerate forward. Now let's look at this from the side so you can kind of see how explosively I'm pushing down. So I'll just play this now. As you can see how quickly and abruptly I'm pushing that board down. And hopefully you can see it kind of squirting forward. But hopefully when you try it, you'll be able to feel it. Now let's look at the technique for generating height. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to ride along, flag the wing, and let my height decrease and then try to regain height. So I'll just play this for you now. So I'm releasing the wing, scrubbing off speed and height, and now I'm going to try to regain that height using the height generation technique. And then we'll glide again, regain our height, and glide again, and then regain our height once more. So let's run through this again in more detail. So I'll just fast forward this here. So I'm releasing the wing, gliding for a bit, we're losing height, losing speed, and we're getting ready for that first pump. So here we go. So I'm about to bend my legs, pushing that foil down and getting ready to explode upwards off my legs and pushing my weight up and forward, and almost like you're trying to throw your chest forward. You know, don't think so much about your head or your arms, you know, more it's your torso, it's all your body weight you want to be propelling forward and upwards. So here we are, exploding off the back leg. You'll see my heel just raise off the board there, but we're still staying in contact. And then the whole cycle repeats again. We're crouching down and exploding up and forwards. You can see my heel clearly raise off the board there, but I'm still keeping contact. And then you rinse and repeat until you get to a point where you've gained enough height that you can glide again. So here we go, we can glide a bit now. And now we're losing height and off we go again. It's fair to say that this technique requires quite a lot of effort, and ideally you want to be preventing yourself from getting in this situation in the first place by starting high on the mast, riding high, minimising the drag you can by getting that foil nice and high and keeping your speed up. But there will of course become, you know, there's always going to be a point where you're going to get too low and you're going to need this technique to dig yourself out of a hole. Now let's look at this again from the side. So here we are, we're gliding along, we're getting ready for our first pump. So here I am dropping my hips, compressing those legs, pushing the board down and getting ready to explode upwards with my legs, but also importantly with my upper torso. Look at my shoulders raising as if I'm trying to jump over something. So here we go for the second pump again now. So we're compressing and extending. As you can see, my rear leg is raising off the board and my heel is rising. And then this last one is a particularly good example. I'm compressing down and exploding. See how upward my body is presenting itself, up and forward. That heel is well off the board and the nose of the board is pitching up to try and gain as much height as we can. And then once we're done, we can get back into gliding again to rinse and repeat once we need to gain height one more time. So as we move on to practicing all of this yourself, a really important first thing to try to do is to learn how to ride that foil really high in the water. So what I'm doing here is I'm just bearing off wind, and then again kind of making myself light, getting that wing up high in the air above me, and then just kind of feeling what the foil's doing. trying to feel the way that the foil actually feels different as it gets closer to the surface of the water. In fact, if you get it really, really close, you'll actually hear the water flow over the top of the foil, and it'll be disrupted as it flows past you. But for the purposes of this, all we're trying to do is just get that feeling of getting really nice and high on the foil, which is something you probably won't generally do with your normal riding. And once you've done this, this will kind of set you in good stead for some of the things that we'll be doing later. So now we're really going to start getting into the practice. So what we're going to do here is to actually ride the board upwind and then to pump upwind. Now what you can do is you can actually just point your board crosswind and just pump with the wing in hand. Let the wing out so that you've got very little power, and that works perfectly fine, but there is the tendency that you might have to just kind of sneak that power back on again and not really realise that it's difficult to know if the technique's coming from your pumping or actually from the wing. But if you bear the board very high upwind or very high downwind, you can't ride in those directions, so it's got to come from your pumping. So what I'm going to show you here is we're riding crosswind, and soon enough we're going to point that board upwind, and we're going to get to a point where we're going to start feeling that we're going to be losing power. And then, we've got to this point now, and then we're going to start pumping. And hopefully you'll feel that you slowed down as you started to bear upwind, but now you've started pumping, you should feel that you're actually speeding back up again. And you can make this more difficult for yourself by actually pointing the board further upwind. As you see, I'm pointing further upwind than I was before. Or if it's kind of getting a little bit too difficult, you can bear that board back downwind again to get a little bit more assist. I think this technique is really, really useful in wing foiling in general. Besides actually learning to pump, if you want to get around some rocks or an obstacle or something like that, or a buoy in a race, it's really useful to be able to go that much further upwind than you could normally, and utilising pumping to do that. So just keep on doing that, and hopefully keep your speed up, and hopefully you can ride out and try this plenty of times until you get really nice and comfortable with it. Right, so now we're going to move on to doing the opposite. So we're going crosswind and we started to bear downwind and get to that point where the wing really starts to feel very, very light in your hand. So we're getting to that point just about now. And again, we're going to start our pumping. You'll find that wing get really, really light in your hand, and the further downwind you're pointing that board, the more and more difficult it'll be to actually hold that wing, but the more your pumping effort is actually propelling you along. Similarly to pointing upwind, you can actually bear your board a little bit more upwind to actually gain a little bit more assist, or to actually point it more downwind to really start to be pumping almost as if the wing wasn't there at all. This is a really handy little technique, and again, it's got some utility to it. You can point further downwind than you'd normally be able to go. And again, like before, hopefully you're coming out with sufficient speed to be able to do your jibe and tack and carry on practicing. Now we're really starting to get there. So let's start having a look at how to pump with a flagged wing. So similarly to before, you're riding along comfortably, you start to bear off downwind and you get that wing flagged. Hopefully you've practiced flagging a wing before, so I won't go into detail of how to do that. And you get yourself into that nicely flagged position. Don't wait too long before you start pumping. You will want to start pumping almost immediately. Get that wing nicely flagged, nicely down by your side here. As I said kind of earlier on, the wing does actually help you have a certain amount of balance, and it's really, really helpful. It'll quieten down your whole body movement. So now we are basically pumping along. Now one of the things you need to be a little bit careful with especially if you watch the wing, the more you actually point the board downwind, the more difficult it'll be to keep that wing flying. So I am pointing quite far downwind here, and as you can see, it's starting to drop into the water. So when you feel this, as you can see, what I'm doing here is actually I'm starting to raise my rear hand up to keep that wing out of the water, or the alternative is to actually point that board a little bit more into the wind to get a little bit more air into it. And then once you've completed your run, hopefully you've still got some speed to ride out. But certainly when I first started doing this, I was touching the water, and that was kind of the end of my pump. But hopefully, if you can kind of decide to actually stop doing it before you touch the water and rinse and repeat, you'll be able to get a lot more practice in and not spend all your time clambering onto the board again. So I'll just show this one more time. So we're riding along, getting that wing flagged, starting to pump almost immediately, and then we're really starting to watch how much air is actually in that wing. I'm starting to bear quite far downwind here, and now I'm starting to bear a little bit more upwind to actually keep that wing flying. And then we've completed our first downwind pump. Now let's look at this nice bit of footage from the side. So as you can see, I've started the pump with a really high board position. I've got that wing flagged and I'm ready to start pumping, which I do almost immediately. And it's worth noticing sort of how much I'm extending my body upwards, kind of throwing my shoulders up and forwards. One thing you will notice is that the board is dropping slowly into the water, and you will need to concentrate more and more on generating height as you get into this position. But hopefully you'll be able to ride out with speed once you actually get to the end of your pump, like you can see just about now. So to finish off, let's look at getting rid of the wing completely. So in this I have an anchorman leash, which allows me to completely drop the wing into the water, and it'll stay largely where I left it. So I've just deployed the little parachute thing here, and in a few seconds I will drop the wing into the water and pump completely unassisted. What you will notice is once I actually I've dropped the leash, dropped the wing in the water, is that my arms are considerably more busy. As I mentioned before, the wing does actually help in giving you quite a bit of stability, and you will actually find that pumping without the wing is quite a bit more difficult. It's easier in a way that you can go completely downwind and not have to worry about the wing at all, but it is more difficult in the way that kind of your balance needs to be more precise. You don't have that wing to kind of lean on. So yeah, I've got a pretty far distance downwind and everything has got to come to an end at some point. I've got a long swim back. So at some point you have to decide that enough is enough and we're going to call that pump a day. So all that's left now is a very long paddle back to try it again. We're done for another video. So yeah, learning how to pump is quite a long process. There's lots of finesse to it, learning the balance, learning the timing, there's a certain amount of strength that's needed and coordination, and all of this takes time to master. I hope that, when you get out and try your first few sessions, you'll really see some of the things that I've talking about and see the improvement that you'll get from it. But you do need to be in it for the long run. But it's oh so worth it. Once you can pump properly, it'll really benefit your winging game. Being able to subfoil, it'll help your foil drive. And many aspects of foiling. It really will pay dividends. So, with that said, I hope you did find this video useful. I hope you get on out there, and I'll see you in another one. Bye!